interview you for your book one of these days, I think.
It's getting more interesting every week, isn't it?
Yeah. The plan tonight was for me to do a little reading from the book to start with, and so glad to give you just a little taste of that book from I'll read a little bit from the introduction and from the conclusion. And then Margaret had a few passages that she wanted to highlight, so we're going to be sure to give her a chance to do that. And then we're going to talk a bit about the legislative branch of government, which I think becomes tonight really a timely conversation as we see the consequences, I think, of the weakening of our legislative branch, both at the state and particularly the federal level. We think about what legislative leadership requires. I have two former speakers in the House here, so we can talk a good deal about what legislative leadership requires, how it's different from executive leadership, how it's in our system, the particular role that plays. And we can talk about how we get out of the mess we're in. And I don't have particular answers, but I bet some of you have some thoughts, and that's where all of you can come into this conversation. So that's the plan.
All right, let's do it.
All right,
Do you
let's
want me
do
to
it.
hold your mic?
Oh, I think I can juggle.
Okay.
We'll
All
see.
right.
We'll see how we manage. I'll be starting just reading from the introduction of the book. From the vantage of 2025, when I was writing this, there's something quaint about the political style of Martin Sabo. A leading Minnesota legislator and congressman of the late 20th century, Sabo was a shoe-leather, door-to-door candidate who never aired an attack ad or publicly slung a demeaning epithet at an opponent. He was a student of the inside baseball of the legislative branch of government, the calendars and committee assignments, the fiscal notes, office space, and yes, he also studied baseball. He cared not just about what government did, but also how it performed and which level of government was best suited to the task at hand. He didn't just refuse to demonize members of the opposite party, he befriended them and encouraged their participation in decision-making. Those characteristics may sound like the practices of an earlier time, but that does not mean they should be dismissed or forgotten. This book was born of a conviction that the Sabo story is well worth telling amid the cutthroat partisanship that characterizes 21st century American politics. The anxiety many Americans feel about their system of government makes now an apt time to examine the life and work of someone who showed that it is indeed possible to make the system work for the better. And I must tell you the reason for the better, quotes here, is at one point that was the working title of this book. The publisher had other thoughts, but that's what was thought when this was written. Martin Sabo was an institutionalist, but immutable preservation of the Minnesota or the United States Houses of Representatives was never his goal. He sought those bodies' improvement. He was too modest and realistic to claim that he sought their perfection. For the sake of making them better able to deliver the public services he believed Americans deserved. When he concluded that institutional rules and norms needed to change to better meet society's needs, he willingly led the charge to make those changes. But when critics denigrated those institutions or sought to make them dysfunctional, particularly for personal or partisan gain, he rose to their defense. Despite his lifelong attachment to those two elective bodies, he understood that they belonged not to him, but to the people, and that his role was one of stewardship. Good old Norwegian Lutheran word that we Methodists also like to use. And then I'll switch to the conclusion here and talk a little bit, which tells a little bit about how this book got its start. How to assess Sabo's legacy. It's much more than a rail line or a bike path, more than his name on a post office, a bridge, or an academic program at his alma mater. It's even larger than the public policies he helped craft and enact, significant though many of them were. It lies more fully in Sabo's effort to make local, state, and federal governments more responsible and responsive to the people they are intended to serve. That work produced its most notable achievements in the Minnesota legislature of the 1970s, transforming an archaic, unambitious institution into a potent instrument for the betterment of Minnesota's lives. That work continued in Washington, where he led efforts to make the federal government solvent, so it could be a dependable ally of the American people. The man who approached me to write this book at the behest of a group of Sabo's friends wanted me to lift up something more. I'm hung up on leadership, Bill Kelly said. Maybe some of you knew Bill Kelly. I know no one more intent than Martin was on making the system work better for all the right reasons. At age 82 in 2022, Kelly was ailing with the cancer that would take his life on July 31st, 2023. Like his friend Sabo, Kelly had a lifelong love affair with representative democracy. As Sabo did at the end of his life, Kelly was watching with dismay as elected officials often appeared to put short-term electoral advantage ahead of the long-term interests of the state and the nation. Winning the next election was never Sabo's ultimate goal, Kelly said. Good governance was. The temptations of political expediency, the demonizing of opponents, the twisting of facts into half-truths and even lies, the shilling for campaign donors were to be avoided because they undermined good governance. Martin's view came out of his North Dakota experience, Bill said, growing up in a small town. You give a damn about the whole thing, not just your own career or your own glory. It's how does this whole place function? What can you do to make that better? That's what he educated us about, Kelly said. That's what leadership in American government should be about.
So good. So for those of you who have not read Lori's book yet, I hope many of you have. It's just superbly done. It is the story of Martin Sabo. It is the story of the modern legislature. It's the legislature that we still recognize today, which I think it was really instructive to read about those changes that were made and the reminder of them. So let's jump in. Maybe we can do it in kind of 3 different little chapters. Let's talk about what you learned about Martin Sabo's upbringing in North Dakota. Particularly what struck me were not just that he and his dad were close, because he spent a lot of time with his father working, but his mother was quite a powerhouse. Clara?
Clara.
Okay. Can you, there was a particular section about the school and how Clara actually took to the court to raise money after the school burned down, which I thought was incredible and probably really, and you can just,
I'll just tell that story, yeah. Martin grew up in Alcabo, North Dakota. If you were to look at the map of North Dakota and go to the farthest northwestern corner that there is, that's where Alcabo was. I say was because it's really barely there now. It's about 7 people now on a good day. But then it was about 100 people when Martin Sabo lived there. And it was a town of mostly Norwegian immigrants, mostly Lutherans, and that certainly described Martin's parents. Both of them were Norwegian, born in Norway. Martin was a first-generation American, born in 1938. He was born in Crosby, North Dakota, because there was a hospital there, and Clara was a good deal younger than her husband, but was already an older mother. She was 36 or 8 or something like that. She was. They thought that it'd be good to be in a hospital to have this birth rather than it be a home delivery out on the prairie. So that's why his birth address is Crosby, but he grew up in and around Alcabo. Alcabo's one and only school building burned down in 1932. Now think about what was going on in 1932 in the farm economy in the Dakotas. If you've read Sam Friedman's book about Hubert Humphrey those years, well, my family's from South Dakota. I know that story real well too. Your family does too. Those were tough years, and Alcabo was just barely hanging on already then, and so the thought would have occurred to most of us, I would think, let's not rebuild this school, let's consolidate, let's put kids on some kind of a bus or a sled or something, and get them educated some other way. But that was never their concern. They were going to build a school, and the question was only how big, and they were going to put on all kinds of fundraising events. There was a story about a lutefisk supper, though, that the town, that was a big thing for the town, and it attracted 700 people, even though the town only had 100 residents. Yeah. So the willingness to raise money. Clara, Martin's mother, played on some benefit basketball games involving other women in the hopes of helping to raise money. That was a memorable thing enough to get written into the town's history. In 1934, then they built a rather large, wood frame still, but a rather large schoolhouse that included grades K through 12. Even though some of those classes were awfully small, and the place had a gymnasium with a stage so they could put on plays. They, when they had enough young men, they had a basketball team there, and they had a teacher who was good enough to enter the kids in competitions. Martin won a competition for some kind of a history paper he did, and got to go to visit the Capitol in Bismarck at age 11 or 12. It was a big eye-opener and a big inspiration for him. So this was a place that really valued education, and the message was the whole town comes together for the sake of education. When Martin graduates from that little high school, of course he's the valedictorian in his class of 3. This was not a small thing. He had to give a speech. He had to memorize his speech. He goes in with his older sister, who's a teacher at that point, and has to rehearse, because there's no such thing as a sound system. He has to rehearse to project his voice way to the back of that room so that everybody could hear the speech he was going to give. And that was a big ceremony for that little town.
Mhm.
A few weeks later, he's on the train to Minneapolis. Yeah.
To Augsburg College. And I wanted you to tell us stories, both because I think it's, it has two important pieces that I think are really come through in the book that you maybe don't necessarily call out in the same sort of way of other things, but Martin has a deep appreciation for women. And many of his staffers, his top staffers, were women from the earliest days. And I think that probably goes back to that mother figure who is pretty darn strong. And the other part is the education piece, and then coming to Augsburg. And can you talk about what Augsburg was when Martin Sabo showed up at Augsburg? And he really was on the cusp of many transformations here.
That's right. It was a huge influence, Augsburg was, and those of you who just think Augsburg is just another one of those Lutheran colleges, and we have so darn many Lutheran colleges. No, Augsburg was distinctive. Augsburg was born actually originally in I believe Wisconsin, but comes here to Minneapolis in the 1860s with a particular stamp of Norwegian Lutheranism. I'm Methodist, you guys, so if those of you who are Lutherans, help me out here. The Hauge strain, it becomes in the 1890s, born here at Augsburg College, the Lutheran Free Church, which lives for about 70 years. Finally dissolves into the American Lutheran Church in 1963, which dissolves into the ELCA today. But it was distinctive because its motto was a free church in a free land. It was power to the people. It was lay-driven to a greater extent than many other Lutheran denominations were, or like us Methodists. And so there was a real desire to have lay people take on significant roles in this church. And that was certainly the case out of the North Dakota Prairie, where during most of Martin's years, there were 4 parishes that shared a pastor who would preach one Sunday in 2 of them, and the next Sunday in the other 2. And so every other Sunday they would get a sermon by an ordained pastor, and the rest of the time they would have lay sermons, and the lay sermon was often given by Martin's dad.
Lori, we're back to that in rural Minnesota, for sure. In my little Lutheran church, that's what they do.
That's right. We called it in the Methodists, these were circuit riders in the Methodist church. So I know about that as well. But that was how he grew up seeing his dad in the pulpit every other Sunday, probably. Yeah.
So I wore my Norwegian sweater, and I think, Martin and I had a very good relationship. It became closer when I became Speaker of the House. There is a quote that looks a lot like what he always told me, especially when I told him I was going to run for governor. He said, boy, being Speaker is the best job I ever had. Yeah. And I think he really, really believed that. He thought that and part of it was the time he was in and what was built there. He'd probably like it even better that through my ancestry now I've figured out I'm actually half Swedish and half Norwegian.
Oh, yeah.
So he would have really loved that, right?
I
would have been. It would have been a whole different thing.
That's it.
So one of the things that plays prominently in Augsburg is this group of young men that he meets, as well as his political science professor.
Carl Trisline.
Yes. And how important those two things are, combined with Augsburg and the Seward neighborhood, and how that plays a role throughout his life, really, in terms of how important it was. But can you talk a little bit about those young men who all met at Augsburg?
Oh, yes, that was really a wonderful little nest, a little breeding ground of political talent at Augsburg in those years. This is, he arrives at Augsburg College in 1955, yes, fall of 1955, and immediately gets to know some young people who were involved in in their political club on campus, and were involved in Adlai Stevenson's second campaign for president, and meets this Professor Carl Krislock, who befriends him as, I think maybe it still happens in some small colleges, but I remember in those years being myself at a small college in Iowa, the professors that befriend the lonely kids from far away, those professors make it have a dear spot in your heart and can have quite an influence. And that was the kind of mentoring relationship, personal relationship, get the students to your home kind of thing. That's what Martin found with Carl Krislock. This group of this political club then that Martin is recruited for, it features some names that some of you will recognize. Jim Peterson, P-E-D-E-R-S-O-N, was active in DFL politics and worked for the Minnesota House for many years. He was sort of the elder of that group. His younger brother Dwight was with them as well. Harlan Christensen is another name those of you who hung around the legislature will recognize. Harlan was on the legislative staff for many years and did a variety of things in politics. Across the street was a hardware store that was owned by a widow whose name was Schwarzkopf, Lyle Schwarzkopf's mother. And Lyle, of course, has left us. Lyle was a Republican, and he features in the story as well, but he knew all those fellows. They were all together. And Lyle winds up in 1958 marrying one of the professor's daughters, Inez. Both of them are gone now, and they were good people from Minnesota. Anyway, that was the happy nest that Martin Sabo fell into.
Maybe if you went to page 33
Sure.
and read from that final paragraph on 33 over to 34, it's the story of how Martin Sabo runs for office.
Yeah. Martin Sabo, by the way, gets elected to the legislature at age 22, which was remarkable then and would be unheard of, I think, today. But there's a meeting at Don and Arbonne's house. That just feels real normal to me. There's a meeting at Don and Arbonne's house in early 1960, I believe it is, and the discussion is, how do we get rid of a troublesome legislator whose last name was Haglund, and who was believed to be taking bribes, was believed to be not crystal clean, and was someone Orville Freeman had decided needed to go. And so they're talking about how they're going to do this, and Fraser and Hemingway wanted Jim Peterson, who was then about 26 years old, I think, to run against Haglund. Jim was on Ray Hemingway's staff. Ray Hemingway was the chair of the DFL party at that time. And Peterson demurred. I wasn't so sure I wanted to be in that mess, he said, that he feared a challenge to Haglund would entail, because Haglund wasn't a Democrat. He was in the liberal caucus. Peterson countered with a different idea. How about Sabo? Martin had confided to his roommate Peterson that he had hoped to run for elective office one day, though he had not spoken specifically about a bid for a legislative seat. Jesus Christ, he says. This is Hemingway, who was a colorful speaker. Is he even old enough to vote for himself? Hemingway asked. Peterson assured his boss that Sabo was about to celebrate his 22nd birthday. His birthday was in March. Voting age and the age of eligibility for legislative service was 21. Okay, Ray Hemingway barks, it's settled. You go home tonight and you tell him he's going to be the candidate. Then start teaching him what the legislature does. Hemingway ordered. He punctuated those instructions in characteristically blunt fashion, I think, with some colorful language that didn't get quoted to me by him. Either you find a candidate to run against Haglund, or you're fired. Peterson did as he was told. I argued against it, Sabo would later relate. I told Jim I was too young to run against someone in my own party. Peterson vowed to deliver the DFL endorsement to Sabo at the party's April 2nd convention. This is like 6 weeks from this conversation. He promises to take charge of fundraising, and he arranged for a few persuasive phone calls to Sabo by Fraser and Hubert Humphrey. I lost the argument, Sabo said.
I love it. I love how that story comes about. Everybody has an origin story in this, and that is the Martin Sabo running for office origin story. And that really unleashes what he is known for, still known for, I think. Of course, this modernization of the legislature, his service in Congress, but it was the style of campaigning that Martin would do. And I will say that I think Martin taught a couple of us how to door knock, and I think you should say a few words, and then I'll say a little more about that.
Yeah, well, in his first campaign, he had very little money, but he had youthful energy, and decided that the way he would campaign would be the way he would campaign if he were still in North Dakota, person to person, one door at a time. He was, in that first campaign, he got very little press attention other than toward the end when somebody pointed out, it got written up in the paper that he had door knocked 12,000 doors, which is a lot. When you have to, in those days, you ran as a House member, you ran in the entire Senate district. You ran at large within the Senate district. And he was the new guy. There were 4 candidates on the ballot. The top 2 vote getters would be elected to the House, and his goal was to get past this fellow Hageland that he was trying to oust. The top vote getter in that district was a labor guy who had been in office for some terms named Jim Adams. Martin Sabo managed to come in second, managed to get elected, managed to beat Carl Hageland, and did it on the strength of shoe leather. His district entailed what we now think of as, what we now know as the Savali neighborhood, the Cedar Riverside complex. Those buildings weren't built yet. It was a rundown, lower class, shall we say, working class, mostly Scandinavian neighborhood, still kind of in the orbit of Augsburg, which was there because it was serving that Scandinavian neighborhood.
And that door knocking remained important to him all the way through. He was legendary for organizing these door knocks. You would meet up and out you'd go. I mean, I door knocked long before I was ever a candidate myself, but the one thing Martin taught me to do as a candidate, and you talk about this, this is not about going in and having a lengthy discussion with anyone, not at all. This is a meet and greet, a quick dip in to say hello to someone. So one time Martin and I were door knocking. It was a high rise, and it might have been my first campaign, maybe it was my second. We go into this lady's kitchen, and on her table are the opponent's pieces of literature. I don't remember who that was or what it was, but he showed me how to do this. You put down your literature, and then you very carefully sweep under the other literature, and you just took it away with you. You did a service for those people. They didn't need that clutter around the house. You just took care of it. And that was absolutely a Martin Sabo technique,
Yes.
which was, you don't speak ill of your opponent, but you also don't want them to know your opponent's name. So that was, it was really, when he taught it to me, and he really, and I think Paul would concur with this, and the whole, like, people being too chatty at the door as candidates. I mean, as caucus leader, as speaker, you would go out with these people door knocking, and you would know right away if they had good technique or not. You know, Martin could do an entire, 6 blocks, and every now and then there was a candidate still back on the first block, and he would be like, move that one along.
Well, as a reporter, I went with him a few times myself. I know exactly what you're talking about. He moved
Smoking a cigarette.
Yes, he would pace himself with when he would light up a cigarette. He'd go 1 or 2 blocks and then light up again. 1 or 2 blocks and then it was he, though it was more than just a cheap way to campaign when he was a young guy and didn't have money. He really believed in the representation part of being a state representative, and though he didn't want to engage people in protracted conversations, he wanted to see how they lived. He wanted to look them in the eye. He wanted a sense of some kind of a connection with them, and he wanted them to have the sense that if they needed something from their state government, he could be approached. He wanted to come across as this approachable, real human being. So it was these encounters were brief, but they weren't trivial or of course totally superficial.
They were at the door.
Yeah.
You weren't going in for coffee.
Yeah,
when people invited you in for coffee, you were like, no, thank you. very much, just gonna
Yeah.
keep moving on.
Not totally superficial, and
Yep.
once in a while, someone would say, and I really want you to do X, and he would hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was really, I think, when I arrived at the legislature as a staffer, and I love the part, I didn't realize how much Vanasek overlapped, Bob Vanasek, who was also the speaker later on. I worked for Vanasek. He was my first, professional boss in this work, just non-political, political but non-campaign, and that was the style of campaigning that really was the style we all came up in, which was, you do need money, and you need to adapt to the times, whatever the times were in terms of the advertising and how it's all working. But going door to door, still very valuable, and I think that's still true of the House DFL caucus for sure.
Absolutely.
People can out-shoe leather their opponent, and that is the Martin Sabo, Jim Peterson, Ray Hemingway, that is their model of how they helped get those, eventual majorities in
Yes,
the
yes,
legislature.
yes,
So
yes.
let's talk about he shows up, and,
Well, he shows up and finds a very hidebound, old-fashioned institution that meets every other year for just 3 months and has committee chairs that run as little lords of their individual manners, but don't have much to do with other legislators. And he's shunted aside as the young kid, and isn't more or less expected to sit quietly and vote as he's told. And he begins to be restless with all that, and begins to try to learn more so he could begin to speak up and say a few things, and gradually that works for him.
well, and part of it is, I think, and I knew this, but you're reminding in the book, legislators didn't have personal offices back then. They had a pool office, and then they had their desks on the House floor. That was really their desk. And so he took advantage of that time and would go to other committees. And that is how he became the foremost expert, one of the foremost experts on taxes in Minnesota, on school finance in Minnesota, because he would go sit in the committee room, in the back of the room, quietly, listening, observing. They did catch on to him after a while,
Yeah,
and they were
yeah.
very like, what are
Who is
you,
this?
what
Yeah.
are you doing? He had to, what are you doing? But it was an important part of his learning.
Absolutely, and he figured out early on the importance of the state budget, and the fiscal side of this enterprise was what really attracted him. Now, that's partly, I think, his personality. He had a good mathematic brain, and enjoyed always the study of arithmetic and mathematics in school. I think he was attracted to that as much as he was to politics, quite frankly. The staffers who were working on the fiscal side of things always knew they had an ally in Martin Sabo, because he understood the budgets and the various formulae the way that they did. But he understood that was really where the action was, and decided that would be his specialty. And we called him, at some points in this book, a sort of a liberal fiscal budget hawk, which is kind of an unusual thing. You think a lot of times of people who are focused on the budget as being very conservative. He wanted the state's budget, and ultimately the federal budget, to be balanced for the sake of stability in government services. So that he didn't want them to be funded at a low level, he wanted them to be funded at an adequate or below adequate level, so that this people could get the government services that they deserved and get them in a reliable way. Reminded me sometimes of another person that I wrote some books with, former Governor Elmer L. Anderson, a good name to invoke, because he's also half Swedish and half Norwegian. And he always talked about how important it was that what government did, government should be limited, he would say, but what government does, it's what government needs to do, and it should do those things very well. Martin would have subscribed to that.
Absolutely. And so he shows up, and he's in the minority for a while. This is before party designation. They're called the Liberals, right?
Yes, the
Liberals, but at that point, he's just a backbencher. But he studies and he learns. And then there are a couple key things that happen that people should be aware of. One is the redistricting,
The
which
minute-
was huge,
Yes,
because
yes.
it was, I I don't know if you know the exact numbers off the top of your head, but I remember one that in southwestern Minnesota, there was a district with something like 7,000 people in it.
Yeah.
Okay, a Senate district with 7,000 people in it, and there were districts in the city.
Western Hennepin County with 100,000 people in it, yes.
Mind-boggling.
That we were so far out of whack, and the courts had given the thou shalt instructions to do some things about that. There was a half-hearted attempt in 1959, a congressional redistricting that Elmer signed in 1961, but it was in 1965, I believe, when the federal courts, after several landmark nationwide decisions, when the federal courts looked at Minnesota and said, you do this or we'll do it for you. And I just learned recently that the judge who wrote that decision was Harry Blackman.
Oh.
So it's neat to know, one of ours, yeah. And so then they had to get serious.
Yeah.
And the 1966 election is the first election that produces a legislature that resembles the population of Minnesota, where the western area is finally adequately represented. And some of those rural legislators who lived through that change were not happy. Gordon Rosenmeyer stories, yes.
Yeah,
Not
and
happy.
you might say that some of that still maintains in our politics today. That is probably the origin story of some of that tussle between rural and urban,
Yes.
for sure in this. But finally they make it, and finally he became the minority leader.
1969,
Uh-huh.
after a bunch of Democrats or liberals went down to defeat in 1968 with Hubert Humphrey.
Yeah.
And that was a surprise. People didn't expect that. The 1969 legislature with Republican Governor Harold Evander was, I think, 85 to 60 were the numbers that year. It
Yeah.
was split 85 conservatives or Republicans with only 60 liberals, and that was a low point.
I think it surprised people in this room that then in 1972, the Democrats finally take the House, DFLers take the House, and he confessed that he really struggled with whether to run to be the Speaker. And I actually totally understand this.
Well, now say something about
Well,
that, Margaret.
because you write, and I think Joe Graba was particularly important in this. He struggled between his leadership on the House floor as the minority leader, of the argument, of the back and forth, the debater, versus the Speaker, which when you become the Speaker, and he had this philosophy, this was my philosophy, this was your philosophy, you're the Speaker for the entire House of Representatives. And you have to take a back seat. Your issues have to take a back seat. That's, different than being a rank and file member, being a committee chair, all of those things. And so I think it really made sense to me, that struggle that he had.
Well, you have to take a back seat if you are a person of honor and commitment to the institution, which Martin was, and you were, and yeah, no, it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to do the speakership that way, but you can be a partisan player in
Yes, we've
that
seen some
role.
others.
Yes, but that was not the kind of stewardship, gives that word again, of the institution that Martin thought the institution ought to have. And so he does something that really surprised me.
Yes.
And I made a kind of a big deal out of this in the book because I don't think it would happen today. There had been a previous Republican speaker for a number of years named Lloyd Duxbury, which is a name some of you will remember as he beat on his head back there. And Lloyd was by then a highly paid lobbyist for one of the big railroads or something, but Martin called him and said, should I do this? And with rather salty language, Duxbury said, of course you should. But it took that kind of thinking through, and the fact that Martin would reach out to the Republican predecessor to seek that advice, understanding that Duxbury cared about the institution in the same way that he did.
In fact, the words are from Tom Berg's book, "You dumb son of a bitch, of course you should, Speaker." So, let's talk about legislative reform then, and what happened. I mean, this coincides with an important period of time in US history as well, that, Martin had ideas already about what needed to change in this. He wanted to make sure that things were more open, done out in the open, not behind closed doors. He wanted to make sure that the minority actually had more of a say
Yes.
in the committee assignments. All of those things were on his list already, but it was accelerated by, of course, Watergate.
Well, his opportunity to do those things happens with the first DFL trifecta in state history. We had a second one, and we've had a few since then. It was the second one. We had one as recently as 2023, so you know what that term means. But the first DFL trifecta was in 1973, when because up until that point, the state senate had been in conservative hands for the entire run of statehood. So this was the chance that they had to really make some fundamental reforms, and you're right, Martin had the agenda. I think the 1972 election is worth mentioning because this is when George McGovern, my fellow South Dakotan, was at the top of the ticket and was losing badly to Richard Nixon, including here. The only time, I think, in the last 55 years or so that Minnesota has gone with the Republican
Yes, I've read that
candidate
lately
for
in
president.
some
Yes.
papers of record.
That's right, yes,
recently.
so that was not a good year at the top of the ticket for DFLers. But Martin Sabo had instructed the candidates around the state to use the issue openness in government, which wouldn't strike me as a particularly sexy or appealing issue, but we had just been through the longest special session in state history in 1971 to pass the Minnesota Miracle, and much of that ran until the end of October. And much of that had been done behind closed doors, and people were not happy about that. And Martin capitalized on that sentiment, and capitalized on the people's desire to have more control over their government, and made that the campaign theme. There were Bob Benosic still had his brochure to share with me, and the result, that was a winning theme for legislators. Liberals took the majority at a time when George McGovern and the top of the ticket were going down in flames. That's kind of remarkable.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very counter. And so some of those other things that happened during that period of time, and I am watching our time, so we can go to questions here pretty soon. The establishment of the professionalization of the legislature. Not only the members, but staff. There really wasn't much staff previously. And so Martin and others had this idea about a research arm
Yes.
that becomes Minnesota House Research, which is independent and
Which is
serves
stellar, yeah.
and still
Yeah.
upholds that. I thought it was fascinating, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, OLA, which its reputation is, still so important, and the work that it does. All of these things happen during Martin Sabo's period of time.
Yeah.
And-
Think about that. Lutheran Free Church empowering the individuals to service. That was, he believed that about the legislature too. So the legislature needed to have access to good research so that legislators could have good legislation, good bills to carry, and be well informed. He should, one of those legislators to run to conferences. When the National Conference
Yes.
of State Legislatures was being formed, Minnesota had the largest delegation of any state with 73 members of both parties going to these meetings because he wanted them to have that professional experiences. Likewise, they have their own office space and their own staff so they could do their work properly. Now, all those things were about making the service of the legislature, elevating it and making these people serve better. This is the mindset of someone who himself saw himself as a career legislator and wanted others to function that way as well.
Yeah, the gifts of those things are still there and still intact, and I think that is quite impressive. Now, I have a question for the audience as we start to transition into you asking Lori questions. Who was at that 1992 convention? Lisa. Do you remember this? Okay. Well, I know David Kelliher was there because I was not there. This is the challenge where Martin has probably one of the most serious challenges he ever faced. His first election to the 5th congressional district, congressional seat, was a serious race.
It was 1978, the Minnesota Massacre. There's
Yeah.
the next day in the Star Tribune,
Yeah.
there are all these pictures of all the winners that night, and there are all these Republicans and Martin Sabo.
And that was a serious race because of, actually, Martin didn't like to raise money at all. He would not fit in the modern Congress one bit, and I am most certain that is part of the reason that he was ready to be done when he was done. so that first race actually sort of, had a bit of that indication. But in 1992, he was challenged by a woman Lisa Niebauer Stahl.
That's it.
And that convention lasted till 3 a.m. the next, and I do remember David calling me from a payphone. We were about a month out from our wedding. I'm not sure why I wasn't there. I must not have been a delegate. And he calls me from a payphone. He's like, really? And I'm like, yeah, there were no cell phones. And I remember him calling me at like 10 or 11 o'clock and saying, we're gonna be here for a while. Because and the remarkable part of that story is how they answered the question about endorsement.
Yes.
And so, let's see here, that
What page are we on?
challenge, I'm finding it. You tell it early in a different
Yes,
chapter.
because I pull it forward, to talk about how this man respected the DFL caucus and convention process, the endorsement process. He was a creature of it, and he, here it is.
184.
Yeah,
Go to
there I'm
184.
finding it,
There
yes,
it is,
yes,
I think.
yes.
Is that right? And then,
Yes.
okay.
What ended the impasse in the wee hours of Sunday morning, May 10th, was a question put to both candidates before the assembled delegates, a question that all of you who've been to conventions know. Will you abide by the endorsement?
Now the first question you're asked
That's
in
right,
an
that's right,
endorsing
that's right.
convention.
In other words, will you end your candidacy if your opponent is endorsed? Niebauer Stahl said no, she would make no such promise. Sabo answered yes. His answer both stunned and impressed the weary delegates. This is midnight now here. Sabo was saying that he respected their judgment so much that he was prepared to end his re-election campaign and his congressional career, even though he was on the verge of chairing a major U.S. House committee, if 60% of the assembled delegates preferred his little-known opponent. He was entrusting those delegates with his career. They rewarded his trust on the 7th ballot, endorsing him at 3 a.m. Sabo's promise would not have been credible had it come from many other politicians. But through 32 years in public life, Sabo had built a reputation as a man who kept his word. That, too, made a difference in the small hours of May 10th, 1992. Niebauer Stahl kept her word, too. She ran against Sabo in the primary. She received 28% of the vote.
It's a good place, I think, to transit. There's so much more in the book. I mean, you must read it. But let's go to maybe how it connects and
Yes.
and what questions folks have or thoughts. I mean, it really does. I do think a big piece of his relationships matter. I think that's still true today. God, I hope it is. I mean, I want to believe it is. Trying to break through to Washington right
Yeah,
now on
people,
any
relationships
sort of
matter, and-
relationship is unbelievably hard.
Yeah, and bipartisan relationships especially mattered to him because the goal was governance. And so you engaged the minority for the sake of getting to a good governance result. It wasn't about your side chalking up a win. Yeah.
All right.
I'll just throw out a comment.
Sure. I see.
In 1979, we moved here in the 70s. Jim Lenfest, he ran for city council, and he went. I've gotten into the book about 100 pages, and I've heard Tom Berg's name mentioned. So Jim goes door knocking. Jim's a chatty, happy guy, and Tom Berg is teaching him how to door knock. So he'd go out with Tom Berg and Bob Tennyson, and they'd be about 14 blocks ahead of him, and Jim would still be eating dinner with the people. And they'd say, "Jim, you're not making friends. You got to keep moving." And,
Made a lot of friends.
Yeah, you did.
but he lost. He lost. But anyway, I didn't realize until I read that Martin kind of started that importance of door knocking, and then seeing Tom Berg's name with that, it brought back that funny time.
Yes.
I think
Tennyson
sometimes
tried to teach me, but I was hopeless.
He's got the heart of a poet and writer.
this door knocking story reminds me of how I have observed through years of covering Minnesota politics that we kind of have family trees in our politics. And Martin Sabo, Don, and Armand Fraser, that's part of a rather important family tree on the DFL side. On the Republican side, Sturdevant and I used to talk about Stassen's line that would run through Elmer Anderson and Harold Levander and other people on the Stassen family tree. It's part of the legacy that these politicians that have served us so long and so well give to us. And as I think about, as the national media has discovered in the last few weeks, the distinctiveness about Minnesota and its civic life, and the values that we bring to bear. The fact that people like Martin Sabo, Elmer Anderson, had those values and passed them through their family, the political family trees. It's made a difference for us, I think.
Absolutely.
Could you tell us, what role did Marty play, if any, in, I assume, in the Minnesota Miracle?
Well, the Minnesota Miracle was 1971, and he is the minority leader.
Yeah.
And as I said a moment ago, they had a long special session with lots of negotiations. Martin Sabo was one of the architects of Wendell Anderson's original proposal. In fact, he may have been the legislator, along with staff, the one legislator who had the most input in Wendell's original proposal in January of 1971, which was a proposal for the biggest income tax increase in this state's history and maybe many others. It was, in the end, a big income tax increase, but it also had some other components, so it was not as big a tax increase as Wendell Anderson originally proposed. As the thing bogged down in the summertime, the rules of engagement, shall we say, in all these private meetings were altered a few times, with Wendell Anderson trying to get Martin back in the room, because they considered Martin's voice so important. And I think there were a couple of pieces that Martin really championed. One was LGA, making sure local government aid reached the cities of the first class, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, as well as reaching other communities around the state, making the formula work for the whole state. He and Nick Coleman made sure that happened. And I think we did Circuit Breaker the following year.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But he was already then working on how can we make it so that property tax increases that were beyond a certain level that would be burdensome for people at lower incomes, how could we offer some kind of tax relief, tax credit? That was something that I think finally gets enacted in 73 or 75, and that's called they called that originally the Circuit Breaker, and now it's called the Property Tax Refund Program, but that is one of the survivors of that whole period. Fiscal disparities is another one that Martin Sabo worked on. This is the notion that within the metro area, that a portion of the property tax base is shared metro-wide, and then redistributed by a needs-based formula, such that if you get a new shopping center in your suburb, you're not the only beneficiary of that.
He and Wendell Anderson, this is one thing that I think has really revealed how close he and Wendy are. Wendy and he are very, very close. He and Nick Coleman had more of a tension to them, and certainly he and Rudy Perpich had a tension to them. So that is also interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's personality and culture, don't you think?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Based on knowing them all.
The fact that the Swede and the Norwegian got along better than the Norwegian and the Croatian, that doesn't really surprise me too much.
I was moved to Cedar Riverside. I'm trying to think of it, and I got a job at the Cedar Riverside People Center, and we were trying to renovate that whole building and get the university to give us a way to stay there, and so we had a meeting with the university, and I called Sabo. I'd seen him in operation. On the way over, they said, "How come you called him?" And I said, "Well, I think he'll help us." He said, well, he was very interested. "Well, what'd you ask him?" And they were doing their thing. And so we got there and we sat down. It was very quiet, and two people came out from the U, and the door opens, and in walks Martin, sits down, kind of kitty corner for us. And before, I was going to say something about why we were there, and he stood up and he said, "If you'd excuse me, I've got a couple things I want to say." And he laid out this whole scenario to them. He said, "It seems to me that when you have something you want here and you ask these folks for help, they come right out and they're helping you with it. And it seems like you don't do the same, you don't return the favor." Woo! My buddies were going, "Wow, what?" And because I think that kind of conservative side of him didn't make sense to them. They were And, so anyway, I just wanted to note that, and he pulled the whole thing through. He'd call up and he'd ask, you know, how's it going?
Well, he would see himself as a problem solver
Yes.
at the local level, and had played that role since he was elected to the legislature as a 22-year-old. That was part of his job.
And
Yeah.
he knew how much healthcare was important.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
I told Lori the story of, yeah, I was still in the minority, because I was sitting in my seat on the House floor, and there had been a long time dream to connect the Cedar Lake Trail to the river. And this was at the same time that the new Twins ballpark is being discussed. And he knew that I was working on that issue, the ballpark issue, but he also knew that part of my role in that was to make sure that we didn't lose the trail and we didn't lose access, and that there was a community benefits agreement for people. So my phone rings on the House floor, and they're under the desk. I answer it. I expect it to be someone on the floor giving me a hard time about something, because that's usually what it is. No, it's Martin Sabo. And he says, hey, I just secured a couple $1 million for the Cedar Lake Trail down to the river, so now it's your part. You gotta get the state's part of it done. And I was like, okay, yep, Congressman, I'll get that done. I told Lori it was actually one of the things I was most scared of when I was running for governor, because if you do the per mile cost of that trail from where it ended to the river, I think it's about $4 or $5 million.
Well, that land wasn't cheap, as I recall.
It was quite a feat, but it was also, it tells the story of you do your part, we'll do our part, and that was a thing over and over again with Martin.
And the man was a big cyclist.
I know, Dave was gonna. So the funny part of having the Sabo Bridge named after Martin, all of these bike trails, he did not ride a bike.
He never rode a bike. He never rode a bike.
You know, you had Jim Oberstar, who would ride 100 miles in a day.
That's right.
And then you had Martin, who was like, meh, no,
Yeah.
no.
I don't think he owned a bike growing up.
Did he ever stop smoking? I
No.
never saw
Well,
him
yes, he
smoke.
did.
Yes,
Yes,
he
he
did.
did. Yes,
He
he
did.
did. He switched to cigars.
Yeah.
At some point, and then eventually stopped completely, but by then, of course, the damage was done.
Yeah.
You know, I never saw a guy suck on a cigarette so hard.
You know, it's funny, as I would interview people for this book, inevitably, people would comment to me about his smoking habit. It was such a signature part of his life. You wanna do the Phyllis story?
Yeah, the Phyllis story is just so good. So, 150, if you're following along. At the start of the 1975 session, Khan announced her intention, this is Phyllis, announced her intention to sponsor both a smoking ban statute and rules change banning smoking on the House floor. She took the latter proposal to the House Rules Committee, where she encountered the Speaker. Sabo pointedly lit a cigarette and began smoking. The Minneapolis Star's Betty Wilson reported in a front page story headlined, "Legislative Smoking. She huffs, he puffs." Khan remembers him blowing perfectly formed smoke rings at me. The response to Wilson's story was so anti-smoking, though, that Sabo decided to join forces with Khan as a co-sponsor of the bill governing public spaces outside the Capitol. Khan therefore credited the attachment of Sabo's name with the ease of which that bill became law. Perhaps out of gratitude, she altered her proposal. Smoking rule for the House itself. Her new version banned smoking everywhere in the semicircular House chamber except for the dais in the front, at which Sabo presided, and Chief Clerk Ed Burdick and his staff worked. Even though I asked for justice, I see nothing wrong with justice tempered by mercy, Khan explained during the floor debate on the proposed smoking ban. But then his friend Bill Kelly gets up, not so merciful, offers the amendment to ban smoking totally in the House. It passes 89 to 34, and then the Speaker lit one last final cigarette before the ban took effect. I mean, and I think, you know, Bill Kelly succeeded that day and had wanted Martin to quit smoking.
Bill was his best friend in
Yeah.
that chamber, I think,
Yeah.
and so this was sticking it to his friend, but he was also trying to send a message to his friend. Lots of people tried to send that message.
Except he inhaled those damn cigars.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
yeah, he
know,
didn't-
that's right. He was such an addict, yeah.
I assume you must have written something about, I'm still interested in this, but the thing that didn't, I mean, his way of stating it was, pay your CEO
Oh.
whatever you want.
Yes.
Yeah,
But
that's
we're
in here.
not giving you a
Yeah.
tax break when it gets
That's
to
in here.
be more than 25 times what the lowest paid. I mean, yeah.
You're stating
No
it well.
traction then, no
Traction
traction
now.
now.
You're
But-
stating it well, and that was something he introduced in every Congress from about 1991 forward. And went nowhere, but he was recognizing a big, more a symbolic thing than a fiscal thing.
Yes.
How we were creating a society with more and more income inequality. And he saw that, not that he was trying to be punitive to people who were successful, but that it was destructive of democracy, of our democratic shared experience.
Well,
What do you
but
think?
putting it that way, the way he did, I mean, I could not see that even being thought of as punitive, but I know that it,
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it was like,
the fact that it didn't get traction even within his own Democratic caucus
Yeah,
says something
yeah.
about, the way we pay for politics in this country is at the root of a lot of our trouble,
yeah,
quite frankly,
yeah,
and I think
that's,
Martin recognized that. As someone who never really was into raising
Yeah.
money, he didn't have to be. He had
Yeah.
such a secure political perch that he didn't have to raise a lot of money.
It was interesting because I was listening to a podcast today, the Kara Swisher On podcast, and she has Ro Khanna on this episode. And of course, Congressman Khanna has proposed this tax in California on the billionaire tech executives, and some of that really made me think about that bill that Martin carried over and over again, and Martin talking about that. Okay, one or two more, and then we rally.
What prompted you to write the book?
Yeah.
I was approached by a group of Sabo friends. Bill Kelly was the person who approached me on their behalf, but Ed Dirkswager, Eileen Baumgartner, Tom Berg, Joe Graba, Jim Solom, a few others who had been meeting regularly, probably monthly, starting when Martin retired from the Congress. So starting in about 2007, Martin would meet with them quite often when he was still alive, and they continued to meet after he died in 2016. And Tom wrote his book about Minnesota. It's called Minnesota's Miracle, and it's a fine book. I have to recommend it. It was a big help to me. And they kept talking and said, we'd like to have a biography done about Martin Sabo. And so they approached me with that idea, and I said I would like to do it, but I would really like to focus on the Minnesota legislative experience he had in the 1970s, because I saw that as such a transformative time for this institution that has been so important, I think, to Minnesota's success story. And they said, oh, that's fine with us, because we know that was Martin's favorite part of his career anyway. And indeed, there was evidence from interviews that had been done with him that was what he considered the most significant part of his career. So we were off to the races, and Bill unfortunately left us about a year into the research, but we kept on. And it was very kind to have the Minnesota Historical Society Press be our publisher. They've worked with us now several times on various projects.
It's a beautiful gift to really the canon of legislative literature, I think. I mean, it's right up there with Tribune of the People and
Well,
other
thank you.
books that are so important for, I think, every legislator to read, every staffer to read, people who are just interested.
Well, thank you. And I do think it's, bringing us up to the present moment here, it's a good time for us to think about what makes legislatures work. And the thoughts of you speakers in the room here, I welcome those, because I think Martin showed through his style and as well as his focus on what really mattered, he showed how to make the legislative branch more successful, more responsive, better, people within it, better educated, better able to function, better able to do their jobs, encouraging sort of the elevating of the whole enterprise. What we can do now, when some of that has slipped away from us, it's slipped away from us some at the state level, it's really slipped away from us at the federal level, where fundraising has become number one, it seems to me, and most other, toe the line and keep your mouth shut about many other things I posted on Facebook today, can it really be that these Republicans who have served in Washington now, some of them for decades, are really going to allow this president to destroy NATO?
Yeah.
Can it be that these people are really going to allow this president to turn an American city, our city, into an armed camp? Can it really be that that's what's going to be allowed? Are people really going to keep quiet about that? The legislative branch that Martin Sabo tried to establish would certainly have resisted that. He would be heartsick right now if he were
Yeah.
still with us, just to watch this happen, but he would also be working behind the scenes with the people that he knew were of good spirit and understood the constitutional responsibility that was theirs. He would be calling on them in very personal and I think probably pretty effective ways to do their jobs, when they swear to an oath to the Constitution, that means something. That sense of responsibility that came out of El Cabo, North Dakota, and came out of the Lutheran Free Church is something that he tried to instill in all the people he worked with, and I think he was good at doing that kind of preaching. I'd like to hear more of that kind of preaching from the leaders that we have now.
It seems to me that one of the ways you do that is we gotta get this in the hands of every legislator, and you need to record it so people can listen to it, honestly, Lori.
Is there somebody here from the press? We can talk about that.
Because, no, seriously, I think that people need to be able to hear it. So many people are now listening to podcasts as the way that they take in the information. You don't become a Martin Sabo or down the Sabo-Fraser lineage without understanding the history of it. You can't get there without either having experienced it or knowing the history. And so a big part of what's been lost here in the world is, when people don't know their history and then they get into these roles. And I'll just say, maybe that's where I'll stop with the current legislative leadership, that I think I have a problem with them not understanding what the history is and the damage that can be done to the institution.
Well, let me just say one other thing. When I do a slideshow about this book, I've done a few times, the last slide is a slide with a picture of Martin Sabo and a picture of Melissa Hortman. We had in Melissa Hortman someone who very much embodied the style, the values, the institutional commitment, the stewardship that Martin had. And I think that if we could lift them up together,
Yes.
I think that would be useful in Minnesota.
And she knew the history.
Absolutely. And she lived a lot of it too, yes. It
So-
mattered that she had served for almost 20 years herself. It mattered.
Yeah.
It mattered that you started as a staffer and were a creature of that institution for as long as you were before you became speaker. You don't learn these institutions and how to function within them overnight. These are complicated
No, you
institutions.
just have to be an influencer. Never mind.
But we should probably stop so that you all can chat with Lori more, and thank you. I was so glad to do this.
Special thanks to Margaret. Margaret had a little health problem last week, and she's here under some duress, you guys, so a special thanks.
It's good to do this. That's the important part, and I just could not think of, it would be honoring you, it's honoring him to come and do this with you, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, Michael.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, so one quick favor, everyone wants to talk to Lori, let's do it at the glass table, rather than right now before they get to the glass table. All right, so thank you all, there are books for sale at the glass table, we will be there present.
How are you? Well, other than everything, we're doing 7